What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. There is a moment in every collapsing empire where the illusions finally shatter, when even the loudest propaganda megaphones cannot hide the cold, metallic sound of truth. And for Russia, that moment came the second its tanks started burning in Ukrainian fields. At first glance, you might think that these destroyed machines were simply casualties of war and unnatural losses of a chaotic battlefield, but anyone paying close attention knows better. Those tanks were not just symbols of military defeat. They were symbols of decades of corruption, neglect, theft, incompetence, and absolute paralysis of Russia's highest chain of command. Because here is the thing that terrifies the Kremlin far more than NATO sanctions or even Ukrainian drones. Once the invasion began, the Russian military essentially collapsed under the weight of its own lies. For decades, generals were not preparing for war, they were preparing for their own retirement. They were not modernizing the army, they were modernizing their villas, filling their bank accounts, buying luxury cars, collecting foreign property under the names of distant second-level cousins, and then convincing themselves that a real war in the 21st century is just simply impossible. I mean, all of us thought it, but, well, one man changed everything. Why bother preparing soldiers for combat then when you could just instead steal training budget? Then it's not going to be useful. Why maintain equipment when you could just sell replacement parts for cash? Why upgrade the command structure when you could simply repeat whatever routine was written in the dusty Soviet-era manual? So then when eventually February 22 arrived and Russia had to actually use its military for something other than parade and intimidation, the truth hit them like an artillery shell. They did not know what they were dealing with. The entire machine was rotten from within already. Corruption had not just weakened the system, it had completely crippled it. This was not just bad strategy or poor planning, this was decades of theft suddenly colliding with reality. And reality, unlike Kremlin television, does not negotiate. So today, let's talk about how corruption destroyed Russia's ability to wage war, why the military leadership was paralyzed from day one, and how the pursuit of easy money cost Russia more than any enemy ever could. Everyone expected Russia's invasion to be fast, brutal, and unstoppable. After all, they spent billions every year on defense, bragged about hypersonic missiles, showed off shiny tanks on Red Square, and promised that their army was the second best in the world, at least. But, well, all it took was just 1 week of fighting for the curtain to just fall and reveal the truth. The Russian military was an empty shell held together by corruption, lies, and the blind arrogance of men who believe they will never actually have to fight. How tables turned. For decades, Russian generals had been doing the bare minimum. Their logic was simple. If no real war ever happens, then who cares whether the army functions? Who cares whether tanks actually move? And who cares whether radios work or whether soldiers are trained? Just repeat the very basic peacetime procedures, fill out the right paperwork, salute at the right moments, show up in front of correct cameras, and that's it. Nobody will ask real questions. The Kremlin just simply loved hearing that everything was under control, and generals loved being left alone to steal money and not being questioned why they're doing this. So, when the invasion finally happened and the Kremlin demanded results, the highest chain of command simply froze. They had no idea what to do beyond the scripts they had rehearsed during drills. There was no improvisation, no creativity, no strategic thought. They had spent years memorizing slogans instead of learning how to fight a modern war. Their so-called combat training consisted of just paperwork marathons, staged exercises, and photo-op-ready uniforms. Nice and shiny, clean, shaved people. They were not equipped for real conflict, they were equipped for Instagram. And the result? Well, orders that made no sense. Units that marched into ambushes, convoys that ran out of fuel midway, tanks abandoned because nobody expected they will actually have to drive more than a couple of kilometers at a time. Officers who waited for written instructions instead of adapting on the fly. What else could they do, right? Commanders who were terrified of making decisions because making decisions in Russia meant taking responsibility. And responsibility is the one thing in the Russian military has always avoided at all costs. It's always better to just say, I don't know, I didn't do anything, I don't know anything, I was just following orders, rather than to explain why your unit failed so miserably with 100% casualty rate. The invasion exposed them, basically. And suddenly, decades of corruption were not just embarrassing, they were lethal. This was the total unpreparedness kind of aspect of the Russian military paralysis. People simply did not know how to act under real-world circumstances. But economic damage had even bigger consequences on the future success of this special military operation. Let's talk about the economy and corruption in our next chapter. Let's talk about the economic rot. People often underestimate how catastrophic Russian corruption truly is. It's not just stealing a few rubles here and there, it's systemic disease that infects every bolt, every tire, every screw, every Russian box, radio, every explosive charge, literally everything. When you steal from a hospital, people suffer. When you steal from the army, people die. Tanks arrived in Ukraine with tires that disintegrated, because the real ones had been sold years earlier. Batteries were dead, radios did not work, body armor was filled with cardboard or foam instead of actual plates. Helmets were missing, some of them were used from the Second World War, first aid kits were expired, incomplete or even non-existent at all, explosives were swapped for wooden blocks, and nobody noticed, or better say nobody cared until the moment they were needed. But by then, well, it was obviously way too late. All those stolen components, all the counterfeit parts, all the cheap materials purchased via corrupt procurement contracts came back to haunt Russia's troops. Vehicles broke down not because Ukraine destroyed them, even though this obviously also happened, but because their own officers had stripped them down for profit. Soldiers starved because commanders sold their food to Russians. Fuel ran out because drivers siphoned diesel for the black market. Communications collapsed because radios were replaced with cheap Chinese walkie-talkies bought on discount. This was not just negligence, it was self-sabotage. And it was not just the lower ranks, because the higher you go, the worse it gets. A colonel, for example, steals thousands, millions, maybe I don't know. General then steals definitely millions. Minister then steals billions, and well, that's it. Suddenly the army that supposedly costs $66 billion a year to run functions worse than the army that the country that spends $6 billion. That's not incompetence. That's the theft as the government philosophy. You climb the ranks not because you want to build the strongest army in the world. You climb the ranks because you can now steal more, and it's way harder to trace it all back to you. But sooner or later, all the decades of fraud explode right in your face. The more corrupt you've been, the harsher are the consequences. And one day, you got to respond for all the wrongdoings. Let's talk about it now, in our next chapter. One of the most important and least discussed elements of the Russian invasion is this. Russia's highest military leadership entered the war psychologically unprepared. They were not just corrupt, they were terrified. Because real war exposes fraud. Real war requires accountability. Real war reveals who lied, who stole, who falsified reports, who covered up failures, who inflated troop numbers, who pocketed equipment budgets, who bought villas instead of drones, and definitely who the Kremlin trusted to prepare for a future that never came. This is why the command structure simply froze. The generals were not trained to lead. They were trained to just survive politically. Do whatever it takes to just please your boss. In Putin's Russia, a general who tells the truth is punished. Hopefully if it's a bad truth. A general who lies beautifully then is promoted. Well, that's it. So the entire system rewards fiction over reality. When the invasion began, they suddenly had to operate in real time. No script, no rehearsal, no Potemkin exercise where everything is staged to look perfect. No opportunity to bribe a subordinate to cleaning up the mess. Just real combat, real losses, and real consequences. And because they had spent decades living inside a bubble of their own propaganda, they genuinely believed their own myths. They believed that Ukraine would collapse in 72 hours. Okay, if not 3 days, then 1 week. Okay, 1 month, but well, 1 year tops. They believed Russian troops would be welcomed. They believed NATO would not interfere, neither react. They believed logistics did not matter. They believed drones were toys. They believed corruption did not affect combat readiness. They believed lies because, well, lies were comfortable. And when the reality arrived, the Russian command structure responded like a computer that suddenly received an input it was never programmed to handle. It froze, glitched, and that's it, finally crashed. The paralysis was not accidental. It was the direct result of a system designed to hide problems instead of solving them. Corruption did not just weaken Russia, it blinded it. Corruption creates domino effect. That's what makes it so dangerous. A single stolen component can destroy an entire vehicle. A single incompetent officer can destroy an entire battalion. A single forged report can destroy an entire operation. And a single corrupt system can destroy an entire army. We saw already this play out across Ukraine. A soldier, for example, sells a tank battery for cash. I don't know how he can do it, but it happened. And that's it, tank becomes immobile and just gets destroyed. Commander steals fuel, that's it, entire convoy stalls on the highway. General pockets funds for training, that's it, thousands of troops enter combat with no preparation. An official, I don't know, approves cheap, faulty tires, and that's it, whole brigade's vehicles collapse in the mud. Or a minister, I don't know, buys yachts instead of drones, and that's it, Ukraine gets this air superiority. This is the real story of the war. Russia did not just lose equipment, it lost trust, structure, coherence, and the ability to function. Not because Ukraine outspent Russia, not because NATO intervened, but because Russia spent decades dismantling itself for profit. Corruption was not a side effect of the invasion. Corruption was the architect of Russia's defeat. The Kremlin wants everyone, inside Russia and abroad, to believe that its failures in Ukraine came from facing a powerful coalition of enemies. NATO, America, Ukraine, Germany, Europe, everyone is against us. They want to pretend that they were overwhelmed by NATO intelligence, Western weapons, Ukrainian resistance, global conspiracies, or cosmic forces beyond their control. But the truth is much simpler, much quieter, much more embarrassing. That's why they don't talk about it. Russia lost to itself. The tanks burning in the fields were not destroyed only by Ukrainian soldiers. Many of them were destroyed years earlier by the Russian corruption. The commanders who froze on the battlefield did not fail because Ukraine surprised them. They failed because they spent their entire careers stealing instead of preparing. The military that collapsed under pressure did not collapse because it was outmatched. No, it collapsed because it was hollow. There was no foundation. For decades, Russia believed it could cheat history, cheat math, physics, accountability, cheat its own citizens, cheat its own soldiers, cheat the future itself. But there was one place where lies die quickly. And the Russian military has been living on lies for a little bit too long. Way too long than it should have. Well, there you have it, guys. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to my channel for more just like this. The best way to support our work is through becoming Patreon members or YouTube channel members. The links are down below. You will get some additional benefits. Thanks much. See you tomorrow.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in